medieval Christians looked all knowledge as one integrated whole. And the capstone of all of that was theology. That's why they called theology the queen of the sciences. And their idea was that the more you learn science, the more you discover things about the planet and the universe, the more you're going to learn about who God is. So they were actually really tightly connected.
It's the AC Podcast. For the love of God, love people.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. Steve here. Welcome to this week's edition of the AC Podcast. And I'm here with my lovely colleagues, Wes and Andy.
Good to be with you. I see Wes is wearing a tight shirt.
Get out of here.
So apparently you got a free shirt. What did you say? Hey, what's the smallest size you have? Send that one over.
Yeah. I would like one that's shrink wrapped, so that it can form fit over my body. Listen,
man.
Andy, if I wore the shirt that you are currently wearing right now, it would look exactly the same. So.
Well, it is interesting because I was mocking you the other day to my boys, and they're like, "Dad, you're just as bad as Wes." I'm like, "No." And they're like, yeah. So.
You know, I'm not a small guy. Like I'm, 5'9.5" or something like that. But then whenever we all get together for the conference, I feel rather small between the two of you. So.
Well, if you're 5'9", it just means you're taller. So Andy and I grew wider. You grew taller.
What, shout out to Biblingo. Tell us, what is that, Wes?
Yeah, so Biblingo
For those not watching, by the way, he's wearing a Biblingo t-shirt.
I'm wearing a Biblingo t-shirt. So Biblingo is a language learning app, which is designed to help average people learn and retain Greek and Hebrew. So they reached out to me and saw some of my content on Instagram. I was talking about nerdy language stuff, Greek and Hebrew, and they said, hey, why don't we give you a promo code and you can help people at a more of a discount rate learn the biblical languages. So yeah, shout out to them, because if there's one thing that I want partnership with on my nerdy Instagram channel, it's something that is actually related to nerdy biblical stuff. So
what's that discount code? Is it still active? Like,
it's WesHuff10. If they go to biblingo.org and use WesHuff10, they can get 10% off of everything that Biblingo offers.
Okay, that was my next question. Okay, why 10? But now we know.
Yeah, now we know. Mystery solved. I've actually tried it out. It's really fun. So if you've ever found biblical language is kind of hard to approach, like it's a good way to do that.
Yeah.
All right. So let's continue our conversation then from last week. Last week we started talking about this dialogue that Alex O'Connor and Ben Shapiro had. Now, if you're tuning in for the first time today and you didn't listen to the last week's conversation, I encourage you to go back and listen to that. But if you are already locked in and you're listening to this, well, Alex O'Connor is a pretty recent graduate of Oxford University. He studied philosophy and theology. He's better known as Cosmic Skeptic on YouTube. That's his channel. You can go check that out. And he is in dialogue with Ben Shapiro. So Ben Shapiro is a very conservative political commentator, right? And he is I think, editor emeritus of the Daily Wire, and he also hosts his own show, the Ben Shapiro Show. So they are in conversation for this big conversation series put on by Premier Christian Radio. And last week we picked a segment from that conversation, started talking about determinism, naturalism, physicalism, those kinds of things. We're going to continue that conversation today, and we're going to talk about a couple of major issues that we want to pick up on. So why don't we start?
Yeah, just for clarity, so we're going to deal with a different issue today that was a part of that conversation. And this is going to be an interesting one, because I got to tell you that as I was doing some research on this, I can't believe how many people are confused on this subject online. It's unbelievable. So let's get some clarity to this subject.
So let's play the first clip here.
The sort of culture of Europe and its success and America is indebted to Christianity. I mean, this is of course true in a sense, but there's been a recent revival, it seems. I don't really know quite how it's happened. I think it's got a lot to do with Tom Holland, maybe. That's the historian, not the superhero.
Not Spider-Man.
This idea that
Although
actually...
he's good too. He's a good
Actually,
guy.
the great... I wonder what he would have to say on all of this. The Western civilization sort of depends and should be in gratitude to a religious tradition because it provided this kind of ethical framework in which this could have arisen. We hear about the scientific enlightenment. We hear about, the grounding of ethics and God, the creation of natural rights, as if these things weren't established in resistance all the way along to the religious tradition. A society that today... I'll expand on this if you like. A society today that decides that religion throughout its history has been wrong about the position of women in society, wrong about the mortal fate of practicing homosexuals, wrong about the position of the earth in relation to the sun, wrong about the age of both of those celestial bodies, wrong about the common evolutionary ancestry of every animal, including the human animal, on planet Earth, wrong about the ownership of other human beings as private property, now has to contend with a religious tradition that doesn't come to us with contrition and apology and say, well, maybe we were wrong about these things. But no, these are all our things after all. We're going to claim these things. That is, I know that St. Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And that man is the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. But don't you know that the social justice movement is essentially Judaeo-Christian in origin? I know that the Old Testament not only explicitly condones the ownership of other human beings as private property, but gives detailed instructions about exactly how to buy and indeed take them, sometimes including as sexual property. But don't you know that the abolitionist movement was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? Yes, I know that Galileo was shown the instruments of torture by the Inquisition for having the temerity to suggest that the Earth might orbit the sun rather than the other way around. But don't you know that the scientific revolution, which he authored, was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I'd find it funny if it wasn't so offensive to the people who established these very developments against the very religious traditions that now want to claim them as their own.
I just want to make a couple comments as we jump into responding to this video. The first is that I don't know about you guys, but Alex sounds a lot like Christopher Hitchens. It's almost like he's listened to a lot of Christopher Hitchens and kind of has taken on that sort of cadence and style, which to me that's just an interesting point. One thing though I've always liked about Alex is that he does have a way of getting at the root of an issue that I think makes him really compelling. The other thing that I find interesting is Ben, who's a practicing Jew, that defends and talks about Judeo-Christianity, which I don't know if you guys caught that, but I thought that was very interesting that as a Jew, he really has to marry himself to Christianity at some level, which is interesting. And as you listen to the debate, if you watch the whole thing, there's points where he'll kind of jump ship out of Christianity, but for the most part, he is in with Christianity as he's going along, which I just find very, very fascinating. Now that's just kind of a side issue I just wanted to throw out there. But as you guys think about or respond to this, what are some things that you would say?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few things. It's pertinent, I think, like you said, Andy, to mention that these are two very smart individuals, but they seem to drop the ball, particularly in a few different areas, despite getting like some of the facts right. So, Alex there refers to Tom Holland and the fact that Tom Holland, the historian, has written this book, Dominion, and talks about the Christian influence, Judeo-Christian influence on things like modern slavery and the ethics of women. But if he has read Tom Holland's book, which I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he has, he seems to be missing large percentages of why Holland says that there is no abolitionist movement that wasn't Christian. And that, yes, you have these aspects of the Bible that talk about, say, slavery, in the same way that you see that talked about polygamy and divorce, that these are like things that exist within antiquity. But biblical instruction that allows for those things in certain contexts isn't necessarily biblical approval. And that's where I think Ben, who answers, does a very poor job in articulating that, because you have to interpret those things with the broader context of Scripture. I mean, Jesus himself says Moses permitted divorce because of the hardness of the Israelites' hearts, right? And that it wasn't this way from the beginning. In other words, everything in the law is not an approval as much as it's an allowance. And clearly, every time we see instances of slavery, bondservanthood, divorce, polygamy, etc., in the narratives of Scripture, we see it as an example of the clear brokenness that are said from the circumstances of individuals.
Isn't that the case, though? Like, I find that in these kinds of conversations, it seems to me that a lot of skeptics, when they make these charges, they almost forget that actually Jews and Christians teach that the world has fallen. And this is not an ideal world that we're living in. And God concedes, like you said, for example, he makes concessions about divorce and so on and so forth. So I find it very curious that that part, which is a very significant part of our theology, almost drops off the surface there.
Well, and especially for something like slavery, Scripture, yes, allows for certain things, but the whole kind of undertone of Scripture, particularly being created in the image of God, actually undervalues the occupation and the kind of selling of individuals. I just quickly pulled up, there's an Old Testament scholar named D.J.A. Kleins, and he has this great section in his book where he talks about, he says, it is an extraordinary, not to say amusing fact, that the one society in the ancient Near East that had a law protecting runaway slaves was the society that traced its origins back to a group of runaway slaves from Egypt. The point is that Israel experienced God as the one who is sympathetic to runaway slaves, so this law is not just ethical or a legal principle in defense of human rights, but reflects Israel's own religious experience, a fundamental characteristic of biblical ethics.
That's a great point. And there's a couple other things too that we could say with regards to that. Is you see this ethic played out not only in the Old Testament but played out through into the New Testament, and then ultimately would birth a movement that took some time. I think to actually defeat slavery, and if anything, you need to appreciate the depths of human sin and how deep slavery was built into the fabric of human society around the globe, with regards to what it would actually take to defeat. Because in actuality, the Old Testament has rules around releasing slaves, and this was a practice that the Israelites were supposed to participate in. It was in a 50-year cycle referred to as the Jubilee. But from what we could tell, they didn't practice it. From what we understand, it doesn't look like they did release slaves. But what you would see is that this is what they were supposed to do. But this is the theme throughout the Old Testament. I don't want you to go in this direction, but you go in this direction. And then you see in the New Testament where this idea of this heart of stone in the Old Testament being, melted, if you will, in this new system, not one by works of sacrifice, but through Christ's work, that would ultimately validate human life and human value to, I would argue, be an inspiration, saying, this is what we ought to do. We ought to treat each other as equal and with respect, and follow this greatest commandment that Jesus teaches, to love God and to love my neighbor as myself, that would ultimately birth these movements.
And this plays into this idea, and I think it's related to what Alex then says about, related to the status of women, which I think is actually a pretty big blunder on his part. I was recently looking up some of the differences. Someone sent me a video where someone was making the claim that the Code of Hammurabi was basically the same as the Ten Commandments, and I knew that wasn't true, but hadn't actually read the Code of Hammurabi for probably something like 7 years. So I went back and I read it, and what struck me was the classification system that you find in something like the Code of Hammurabi, which is probably our earliest example of an ancient Near Eastern. It's from the Babylon, a law code, but it has different classifications for if you're royal, or if you're a working class person, or if you're a slave. And there are similarities, but I think we would have to expect similarities because these are just cultures living next to each other, right? But what was different that fundamentally, I think, changes kind of the narrative is that when you read the Torah, when you read like Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the allowances are not made. The punishment is not different if you are the king or if you're a slave or if you're, it's everybody is created in the image of God. And when it comes to women, in both the ancient world, whether that's Greco-Roman antiquity or the ancient Near East, we had this fundamental difference in terms of the value of people. And I think I've mentioned, Steve, when you and I were talking one time, that in classical Latin, there is no natural way to refer to a male virgin. It was just expected that if you were an adult male, you were not a virgin. And there's no way to understandably refer to a male virgin. And yet there are 25 ways to say female prostitute in Latin. And how Christianity comes in and completely mixes this up and holds men to the same standards of like sexual purity that women were. Like, this is a radically different worldview that changes the way that people understand things like male, female, and sexuality in general.
What do you guys think of this idea? Because often when I hear Christians respond to these kinds of things, they always talk about trajectory. So you have to think about where the Bible is taking us. It's not just keeping us in one place. There is a progression happening. And so my question is, what do you think of that idea? And secondly, does that, like, how do we know now we're off the trajectory? I don't know if that makes sense.
I'm not sure if I fully understand what you're saying, Steve, but there is something that resonates with me with what you're saying.
Okay.
And that is that I do think that there is a trajectory that speaks to the hardness of the human heart. I mean, when you go back in time, because we tend to want to see history through a 21st century lens, which isn't fair. When you go back and when you start to strip away all the conveniences we have, like military, police, 911 and the like, when you start to see what society was like without roads and common currencies and the like, when you start to see a society that doesn't have social security and all of the safety nets, and that has these practices that we think are terrible, and they are, but they were realities at the time, including war and the like. As you know, they like the seasons of the year, they had war was a season that you go and you protect your boundaries and whatnot. Like, so it's easy for us to kind of point our fingers back and go, these terrible people, but it's like, no, you don't realize how wicked people are. You don't realize how dangerous the world used to be. You don't realize how easy it was to die of starvation and to be destitute and to have everything you own taken from you. Like, you just don't understand until, I think sometimes we'll watch a movie or TV show that kind of all of a sudden gives you a glimpse. It's kind of like if you've watched that movie, The Quiet Place, the second video, where one of the people's talking is like, hey, I know these monsters. You think these monsters are bad, but have you seen what the people are doing? That's who you should be really concerned about. My point is there is this hardness of heart in the way that people have historically treated each other, and you have to ask yourself, what has melted that? Like, what has broken through that hard heart that has led to the kind of society and place we are now, where we have things like hospitals, where we have things like a justice system, where we have things like, slavery being defeated, and we have social security and these different safety nets. And ultimately, I would argue, and I think this is what you see with Tom Holland and others, is going, hey, we have a huge debt to owe. I don't want to say everything's because of Christianity, but many people, many historians are saying, listen, if you're going to be honest about history, we have a huge debt to owe to the Judeo-Christian worldview that has brought about where we currently are.
Well, and it's not just like a debt, it's like a giant IOU. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, right? And this is one of the reasons we're getting Tom Holland to come. Not Tom Holland, sorry. We're getting Glenn Scrivener to come, expounding maybe on what Tom Holland is saying, but speak at our November Ontario conference, because his book, The Air We Breathe, capitalizes on a number of these things where Christianity from its inception, you refer to things like, Andy, like hospitals or charitable organizations or abolition, public education, like those were, if you go back into their origins, were largely Christian movements, or almost exclusively Christian movements.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find a university that wasn't founded by a church.
And I make that point to people from time to time, actually, with specific examples. Like, I live in Alberta, and so I point to University of Alberta and University of Calgary, and I tell them, do you know what their mottos are? Because they actually reflect their Christian origin. At the University of Alberta, their motto is "Whatsoever is true." Now, Christians who know their New Testament will immediately recognize that, right? It's from Philippians. And then the University of Calgary, I lift my eyes up. And it's from the book of Psalms, right? And on and on. So although I hear now that they're looking to change these mottos, but even if they were to change that, it doesn't change the fact that these are institutions that were created by Christians.
And the motivations to create those institutions were Christian motivations. Public education, people wanted individuals to read the Bible. So you increase literacy by creating institutions where children can come and they can read, or, the first public hospitals by the Cappadocian Fathers, or these sorts of things come from this idea of love your neighbor and grow in maturity and be caring to other people. And you see, in the 4th century, the Emperor Julian, who was a Roman pagan, is writing to a pagan priest, and in it, he has this kind of gripe where he says that when he looks at the Christians, he's embarrassed because they don't just support their own, but they support ours, referring to the Romans, as well. And they see how much we lack aid for our own people. This goes right back to the early church and what the early church was doing. And it's the same reason why these institutions developed in the sort of more modern West, is because their legacy is that of Judeo-Christianity.
Guys, you're aware that I've spent a lot of time traveling around the world for various reasons, from adventure to ministry. And I got to tell you, I'm always amazed. I guess these days I get less amazed, but no matter where I go, I am always seeing Christian organizations on the ground level doing incredible work. And I don't want to be rude here, but I'm not coming across any atheist organizations, not to say that they might not be out there, but it's pretty rare. I've never been across one or seen that, or pick your religion. It's fascinating to me, the number of, and this has been noted by many people, the number of Christian organizations that are out there doing good work. And to me, I just think this isn't just part of our past, it's part of our present. We still do great things around the world and are inspired to do that. Now, I think it'd be good that if we kind of transition here, because there's one other thing that he brings up that, as I mentioned earlier, is so prevalent in our culture that we just need to address it. And that was when he brought up Galileo and ultimately the conflict thesis. I can't believe how much this is still held. And I was really kind of surprised and a little bit
annoyed.
I guess annoyed and kind of disappointed, honestly.
You're not mad, you're just disappointed.
that Alex here, Oxford educated, would have this so wrong. But we need to talk about the conflict thesis. This is important that people understand.
Yeah, and Alex in the previous clip mentioned it in passing. There is another segment, though, where he gets into it a little bit more specifically. So let's play that.
Before we move on, I don't know if I can have one final word on this Galileo point, because I know it seems quite strange that I'm sort of hypothesizing in this way, but you said that when religion and science come into conflict, either one is wrong or both is wrong. Galileo was wrong about one of these things potentially. What happens it's great talking about the utility of his religious belief in inspiring his scientific endeavor, but what happens when the immediate fruit of that is him discovering something which should have been a celebrated idea and instead was suppressed, and he ends up under house arrest in Tuscany for the rest of his life? Why? Specifically because the religious authorities, in their sentencing of Galileo, did not just say that he failed to prove it, did not just say that he was, being a bit of an a-hole in his approach to things, but said specifically because it is false, absurd, and contrary to Scripture. That is why that scientific position was suppressed on specifically religious motivations.
And far be it from me to defend the Catholic Church and its crackdown on Galileo. You've come to the wrong place for that.
Andy, I know this is the one that really kind of bothers you a lot. So let me throw it to you. What do you think of all this?
Well, the thing that bothers me is you can do a quick Google search, and even Wikipedia will show you that historians don't hold to the conflict thesis. That this idea that science and religion have been in this epic battle and this whole Galileo affair and everything, which you see Alex, promoting. And man, I got to tell you, as I even just did a quick Google search on it, I see so many threads where this is being promoted, where people haven't actually done any research into this themselves. They're just sharing what they perhaps have seen on some documentary, because I've actually seen plenty of documentaries where they get this wrong. So just to be very clear, this idea of the conflict thesis was invented by two guys, Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper. It was invented back in the 1800s. There's various theories about why they did it. One of the biggest theory is that they wanted to divorce science from theology. You have to understand that science and theology were so interconnected that they were viewed in the same way. They weren't viewed as two separate fields. They were viewed as more or less one field. And so some argue that these two guys wanted these to be separated, that they wanted science to be its own field and to be outside of theology. So to do that, they created this conflict.
Can I just jump on that really quickly? So we actually talk about this when we homeschool our kids, because we do it in the sort of the classical education model, and we often look back to what the ancient Greeks did and what medieval Christians did, and the way they looked at knowledge. And they didn't look at knowledge like we do in modern times, where there are these subjects that you go to, right? There's English, there's math, there's science, and then there's history. And these are all separated. Whereas medieval Christians looked all knowledge as one integrated whole. And the capstone of all of that was theology. That's why they called theology the queen of the sciences. And their idea was that the more you learn science, the more you discover things about the planet and the universe, the more you're going to learn about who God is. So they were actually really tightly connected. And you're saying that these guys who came kind of basically invented or used whatever social forces current at the time, and they really kind of made this a thing, they were trying to separate the two.
Right. And it's very rare that you can look back in history and say, hey, they did it. But this is one of those moments where historians are like, yeah, that's it. And they did it. They invented it. They came up with the various ideas, by the way, that got invented and that have been and continue to remain a part of our cultural luggage, where they invented, for example, this idea that people in the past thought that the earth was flat. That's just not the case. The Greeks calculated the circumference of the earth to a very high degree. They weren't that far off. Thousands of years ago, we've known it was a sphere. By the way, the ancients could look up in the sky and see the moon and go, hey, it's a sphere, right?
It's a sphere.
And one of the other things that we can see as well is, even the monks would say, well, how does the water stay on the planet? Well, they would hypothesize, well, we can see that a drop of dew keeps its cervicity, then surely the planet could as well, sort of idea. So that idea is just nonsense, but yet it still remains with us.
It's interesting because it's kind of like the whole Council of Nicaea and Constantine is the root of all evil within Christianity. These things don't actually have any validity historically, but they're just repeated ad nauseum, and so people just assume that they're true without actually looking into.
Do you think it's also, Wes? Do you think, I don't want to be mean, but do you think it's also because people kind of want it to be true?
I think there's probably a level of that. For lack of a better way of putting it, I think most people are lazy. I'm lazy, so I can say that, and we live in this era where we have kind of this bastion of knowledge in our pockets, which has never been true for most of, if not all of human history up until the last 50 years, where you had people who didn't have the access to the quantity of human knowledge that we have in whole libraries, never mind just walking around in your pocket. And so because of that, and because we have things like Wikipedia, where we can get these very easy summaries, we know a little about a lot, but we don't know a lot about a little. And so we assume that just a very short, pithy understanding of a topic is enough. And it's not, because then we think, oh, well, I'll just look up the rest. And that leads to a lot of issues.
I'm just out of sheer curiosity. Did you guys, when you were growing up, going to school, did you guys learn about the Galileo affair, or was it mentioned in your science?
Well, for me, two things. I was taught that people in the past thought the Earth was flat, and they were afraid to sail because they were afraid they're going to go off the ends of the Earth, which again is just nonsense.
Yeah.
You don't find that. And then secondly, yes, I was taught that about this Galileo affair, and that the church was opposed to science and was fighting with Galileo. Which again, I want to talk about this because that's just
so even in school systems, right, this is being propagated, because that's the only time that the church is mentioned in the science classes, as I remember going to public school, and that was the thing that they brought up. So anyway,
Steve, my kids went to public school, and now they're in private, but early on they were in public. And they came home with their science textbook, and there was a picture of people sailing with a flat Earth and the boat going over the edge.
Oh my goodness.
And so this is still in our textbooks, which is just unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, I don't remember learning that, but I was such a bad student, admittedly, in like elementary school and high school. There's no way you could have convinced me that I'd be doing a PhD when I was in high school.
Yeah. So let's get into that then. What did happen with Galileo? Was he tortured? Was he did he face opposition because he taught that the sun is at the center of the universe? Like what is going on here?
Well, I want to say a couple things about this. First is, I just want to make it really clear that I am not trying to give some sort of apologetic sugarcoating of history. When we look at these things, I think you guys would agree, we just want to be honest about it. If the church did something bad, I'm happy to own that and be honest about that. But I also want to be honest about what actually did happen, and I just don't want to buy into some sort of cultural baggage that we've inherited from two dudes back in the 1800s that literally made up this idea. So that to me is important. I want to know, what actually took place. And what actually took place that might surprise people is a couple things to say about this. The first is Galileo didn't come up with the idea that the Earth revolved around the sun, heliocentrism. Copernicus did. And Copernicus didn't get in trouble for it. In fact, the church encouraged him to publish on it. Copernicus, though, was hesitant to publish on it because he knew that it was going to get some people fired up, but not the church with regards to church doctrine. This is what's going to surprise people. When you study in this time frame, it is Aristotle's idea of first principles, mathematics ruling the universe that ruled the day.
I think that's really important to highlight, is that the first detractors were the mathematicians and the philosophers, or at least the people we would kind of categorize as the mathematicians and the philosophers, because of Aristotle. Because of how influential Aristotle was, I think that's super important for people to realize, that the first objectors, it wasn't the church, even though maybe some in the church then later had kind of some gripes, but it was the mathematicians in Italy who were like, hey, you can't question Aristotle. He's the guy. You can't be the guy. He's the guy.
Well, yeah, and because it would mess everything up, because they had this idea that the universe was mathematically perfect and that it would operate in certain ways that would be, mathematically pleasing, if you will. And this caused a lot of issues because when they looked at the way that planets orbit, they aren't perfect, if you will. They're not circular orbits, they're elliptical. And it would take too much time to go through all this, but they came up with all sorts of crazy ways or interesting ways to mathematically come up with why these things are not happening as mathematically, clean, if you will, as they would like. And then it would ultimately be Copernicus that would say, well, if we change a few things here, then this model starts to make sense, but it's not going to give you the same sort of clean mathematical view of the universe that you were expecting or that you had based everything else on. So in other words, this was a pivotal shift. It was like when Einstein or Newton comes along, right? It was one of those moments where the ground starts to shift and you start to realize I gotta start to see things a little bit differently. And I just want to say something with regards to that. I think that we have to be a little bit more charitable on history when those moments happen, because even today, there's a lot of pushback when somebody comes up with a new idea that overturns, centuries of our scientific ways of seeing the world, and people are not quick to do that. We have plenty of examples, like when electrons were proposed. People didn't want to accept electrons. Why? Because that was going to mess with Newtonian physics. We were going to need a new kind of physics to understand the universe, sort of idea. And you have the same thing with quantum mechanics and the like. So we got to be more charitable historically.
Yeah. I think that kind of connects with what you were saying earlier, Andy, right? Like, we have this, hindsight is 2020, right? We have this tendency of looking back from where we are today. And of course, after, having discovered and learned about electrons and everything and how they work, and we have more knowledge around that, and it's easy to stand on that pedestal and condemn the people back in the day. And it's interesting to me, like you said, like the opposition that these guys faced wasn't necessarily from the church, but it was the academia at the time.
I would say that is true, but now notice when we go from Copernicus, though, who was adored by the church, to Galileo, right, it's a different situation. And what you see, though, with Galileo, ultimately, from my studies, is that he was just a bit of a jerk. And this guy picked a fight, particularly with the Pope, and mocks him in his writing, and was just not a very diplomatic kind of guy. Who was a bull in a china shop sort of individual. But ultimately, from what I have seen and read, is that this wasn't like a science versus Christianity issue. This was more political and a lot more messy. And if people want to read about it, I would encourage you not to go listen to some person with a YouTube channel, but go read like some actual academic work on this. Because when you do, you see historians going, no. You have to appreciate the nuance that's going on here. Why didn't Copernicus get have all the ire that Galileo is getting? Well, there's a great book called The Galileo Affair, a documentary history, that it's kind of one of the main biographies of what took place here that would help people if this is of interest to them.
Yeah, there are also a couple of other good resources, one of which is a collection of essays called Galileo Goes to Prison, which highlights some of these things. And even when there were some church officials that got involved, Galileo has this really great line when the church does get involved and starts to push back, in that he says that the Bible tells you the way to go to heaven, not the way the heavens go. And actually we see, even though from the pressure of the church, and I think what you said is a good description, Andy, he is kind of a bull in a china shop, where he's not very diplomatic. He's not very polite in the way that he addresses these issues. But in 1618, there was actually a number of cosmic events in terms, I think they were like comets or asteroids or whatever, that people saw. And it was all the church who then reaches out to Galileo for explanation and commentary. So even though they were like at odds to some degree because he was rude to them, he was still their go-to guy to try to figure out when there were like astronomical events that happened in their day.
And by the way, to also mention, because of the video, he was not tortured.
Sometimes what's brought up is the case of Bruno, who was another sort of individual who is often portrayed as being persecuted for their scientific beliefs as well. But actually, if you look at what Bruno was teaching, he was a theological heretic. He included himself within the Trinity. And so the church is like, listen, all your scientific stuff, we're fine with that, but don't say you're, part of the divine Godhead. And he didn't stop saying it. And so they did persecute him. Now, we can talk about whether that was right or not, but it had nothing to do with science.
And Wes, it goes a little bit deeper than that, because this I always find interesting. I'm watching this documentary by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he lifts up Bruno as this scientific, patron of science, right? He is this guy who's fighting against the church, and he's fighting for science, and he's fighting for heliocentrism, that the sun is at the center of the solar system. But what he fails to tell you, of course, and why the church would be so upset with him, is that the reason that Bruno wants the sun at the center is because Bruno believes that the Son is God. He worships the Son. And like Wes, like you're saying, he's got these other crazy beliefs that he holds to as well, which you're like, and so this is where I'm just saying caution to the listener. You just got to be careful, because it's so easy for people to put this one-sided gloss on history that gives you a very distorted view. And so let me actually peel back some of that gloss as well, because if anybody has ever read Copernicus or Galileo or Kepler, you would find it very uncomfortable. Let me just say that. You would, as you read them, you would think of them more as doing astrology than astronomy. So we got to be careful as we, I don't want to put too nice of a gloss on what they're doing, but I do want to appreciate that they were doing cutting edge research, trying to figure out the way the world worked. And again, you need to have some graciousness to the past and how they were trying to piece everything together that would ultimately lead to where we are today. I am sure that hundreds, thousands of years from now, they will look back at us and they will have similar feelings to the views that we currently hold.
One thing that this reminded me of is this interview that Andy and I did with a Cambridge historian named Seb Falk, and he wrote a fantastic book called The Light Ages. Obviously, this is a bit of a play on words, because the medieval times were often called the Dark Ages, and he is basically pushing back against that idea. I highly encourage you to, we'll leave that link to that interview in our show notes for this week. I highly encourage you to check it out. But I remember very specifically when we were planning for that interview, I received an email from somebody, Christian. He knew that we were going to talk about this, and he was wondering why we were bothering going back, talking about things that happened in the past, rather than, how are Christians doing science now? Like, well, how do their beliefs line up with where science is going? Like, why don't we talk about what's happening now? And it's precisely because all of the sort of our perception of the relationship between religion and science is so often based on what we think we know about history. And that's why we're spending our time talking about this, because we need to set the record straight.
Now, speaking of setting the record straight, there's one last thing that we need to address before we close off this podcast. And that is that Alex O'Connor takes it even one step further. Let's show this clip of him basically raising the question of whether or not Galileo or others like Newton were actually Christians at all. Maybe they were just atheists that couldn't be honest about what they really believed.
To backtrack a moment, because you said more than one thing in what I just responded to, you also mentioned, you talked about Isaac Newton being a Christian. So, I mean, people were astonished discovering his private notes to find that he spent more time talking about theology than he did science. This is certainly the case, but I do think it's worth pointing out when people like to notice that the originators of the scientific revolution in particular were believers in God. There are a few things to say on that. First, we don't know what Galileo thought in his heart of hearts. And part of the reason for that is because despite tripping over himself to say, now look, I don't think Scripture is wrong. Now look, I believe in God and I am a Christian and I believe in Scripture, but maybe the earth orbits the sun. His life falls apart. So suppose he did secretly have doubts about the existence of God. Do you think we'd ever have even found out about it?
And that's an unfalsifiable argument.
I think not a chance. In other words,
but the lack of falsifiability makes it difficult for making a counter argument.
In other words, let's not be so
maybe
confident.
Maybe he did have a secret diary, but I have no proof that he had a secret diary.
What I'm saying is, let's not be so confident about this. The second thing,
I think we can pause there. So he brought up a few things there. One is, we don't really know. Like, we wouldn't expect to actually hear from somebody like Galileo if he really doubted the existence of God. So he's not making the case that Galileo did have those kinds of doubts, but let's be a little bit more careful before we start expounding on the fact that all these, the fathers of the scientific revolution were religious, right? They were Christians. Maybe we have time just to address that specific point. So let's stop there.
Well, let me say this. As someone who considers themselves a historian, What was just done is really bad history because it's what we call an argument from silence. And arguments from silence range on a spectrum of bad to worse. That's the spectrum because you in history, you don't argue from what you don't know. You argue from what you do know. And what do we know? We know that individuals like Francis Bacon or Galileo do talk about their faith.
Newton, John, Locke, the list goes on.
Yeah, so many of them. And so if we're going to posit something, we need reasonable evidence to do so. We can't just say, well, what if Galileo was a reptilian alien from Mars? Well, that would change the whole spectrum. And it's like, yes, it would, but we have no reason to believe that. And we have just as much reason to believe that he's a reptilian alien from Mars as we do that he was an atheist. And I don't say that lightly because what's being missed is the motivation, right, that Alex seems to miss. C.S. Lewis on his book on miracles says that men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. And I think that's what Alex is missing. Is it's not just that these men were religious and then they came up with the scientific method and that's the foundation of modern science. It's the motivation for why they did what they did to begin with.
And one of the things that we're seeing this sort of idea in academia more and more, that's one of the reasons why we want to highlight this, is I see this regularly when, for example, if it's, say, Thomas Hobbes, for example, and if you read a lot of these people that will often get talked about for either their scientific work or political theory and the like, the theology that they wrote that's often in the same book, and the theology, as is even being mentioned here, often is even more than what they're known for in academia, is completely divorced from the person. So whether it's Thomas Hobbes or John Locke or Newton or the like, they get divorced from the theology. And what happens, though, is you start to get a very skewed view of history. And if you're not careful, then you lose that aspect of what happened and what led to a lot of these sorts of ideas developing, and can now begin to give you a false view of history. It's kind of like this rewriting of history where we're going to go, oh, okay, we like this that they did. We don't like this other stuff they did. So we're just going to leave all that other stuff out, which I think is it reminds me of, 1984, right? We're just going to, the book, we're just going to get rid of, the parts of history we don't want. We'll just rewrite it, which I think, Wes, maybe you were there when this happened. I was in Toronto speaking, and there was another guy speaking at this at the university there, and he was talking about Darwin, because this can go both ways. Where he was talking about Darwin, and he was showing Darwin in this very positive light. And during Q&A, I asked him, I said, in Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, he refers to Europeans as the summit of civilization, and that a day is fast approaching in which we will exterminate our savage progenitors. And he goes on with regards to this. And that's a part of evolution that people have also quietly just kind of swept aside and said, oh, okay, we don't like that part. We won't talk about that, but we'll just talk about the parts of evolution we want. And intriguingly, when I brought this up to him, he said to me, well, Andy, you just haven't read Darwin careful enough. That if you fully appreciate what he's actually trying to say, then you would have a clearer view. Apparently that wasn't clear enough.
Yeah, I was there, and it was kind of this revisionist rewriting of Darwin, who, by the way, the subtitle for his book, The Origin of Species, is The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. And he wasn't messing around when he said that. He actually believed that the whole his theory of Darwinian evolution was an idea of that some races that exist today are less evolved than others. And that was a good example, Andy, of someone who was kind of, they were writing in what they wanted to be the case rather than like allowing the words on the page of these individuals to speak for themselves.
Yeah, and if you actually look up the book on the origin of species on Amazon or wherever you find books, you won't find that subtitle right on the front page. You have to go. Yeah, you actually have to go deeper inside.
Yeah, Steve. Sorry, Steve.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of the new books don't include the subtitle anymore.
Right. Any last thoughts here? Because we're coming to almost an hour mark.
So basically, what I think would just be helpful for people to appreciate, I want to be careful not to give like a Christian gloss to history as well. I want to be honest with what actually happened and make sure that we're getting a fair view of history. So I hope that that's clear of what's happening here. And so when you have read and you do have this understanding of the history, and you can get quite frustrated by having that gloss being put on things. And it can be done by both Christian and non-Christian. As another example, when I went to seminary, I was told about Martin Luther, but never was I shown any of his anti-Semitism or some of the terrible things that he had said. And I would say that was a disservice to me, right? It was an unfair view of history that gave an overly generous view of Luther that was unnecessary. So I just hope it's clear here that that what we're after is the truth in a clear view of history, and not just taking on ideas that we've inherited, but actually seeing it correctly.
Yeah, the whole Matthew 7 principle, right? Take the log out of our own eyes so that we can address the speck in others. And I think if people are interested in that, there's a historian and scholar, John Dixon, who has a book called Bullies and Saints, which does a good job of addressing that, talking about some of the stuff that I think we as Christians do need to be aware of in terms of this inheritance that we stand downwind of as Christians for things within the Christian tradition that don't live up to the standards of that which Jesus calls us to loving our neighbor by. We can admit that, but also say that is not a true representation of Jesus without trying to gloss over it and make the church seem like everything's hunky-dory.
Okay, I think that's a very good note to end on. Let's wrap it up here. Thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us for this edition of the AC Podcast. I hope you really enjoyed and were encouraged by these last two episodes as we offered our reactions to the dialogue between Alex O'Connor and Ben Shapiro. The AC Podcast is a ministry of Apologetics Canada. You can find us on your favorite streaming platform. So like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to help us out. And we'll come back next week with more stuff to think about. Until then, you know the drill. Love God, love people. Bye for now.